Sean from Crafted Elements. Our company's been making large format silicone molds since 2019. These molds are made of very thick, very durable silicone. We make them for woodworkers and resin artists and makers just like you if you're watching this video. And today this is going to be a really cool video. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while. We've just been so busy and I've been doing some other side projects and stuff, but you've probably seen some guys like on Instagram like Scott's Mini Wood Shop or Dairy Woodworking. They make some really cool cast resin blocks with models in them that I know Scott does some wood turning and turns them into balls and cubes. I know Illuminolite has a video on their website with that demo. So basically we have a set of molds that are really for that purpose, making thick solid cubes. So in this case, this is a 6x6x4. Here's an 8x8x3. We've also got a cylinder mold. There's a bunch of molds, I don't know if you can see in the video, but sitting on the desk behind me, and these are all cube molds. Now cube molds have multi-purposes. You could make things like lamps with them. You can make sculptures or dioramas, so to speak, which is what we're going to do today. You can make just big paperweights or really just artistic objects. A lot of resin artists I see will use these types of molds and these sizes of molds for encasing wedding bouquets. So like a keepsake, where we'll take the wedding flowers, put them in the mold, cover them in resin, or dried wedding flowers, put them in the mold, cover them in resin, and sell them to the bride and groom as a keepsake. So there's a lot of different things you can do with these molds. That's probably not an exhaustive list, but what I want to talk about today is the different types of resins, and we're going to actually do a full pour using one of these molds and some pieces I've pre-cut. So what we are going to do today is a really cool thing. I'm a big Star Wars fan. A lot of people are big Star Wars fans, but whether you're into Star Wars or anime or any other sci-fi, anything else, you can make these types of sculptures because there's tons of these models depending on what you follow and what your vice is online. I shouldn't say sculptures, but tons of toys and things like this that you can cast into resin. So there's a lot of different elements to this. It might just seem like you put it in there, you pour your resin, you're done. But there's resin considerations. There's which is a function of volume and heat, and then there's also even the toys, the models, and the wood that you use are all going to depend and have an influence on the final product. So I want to get started talking about the types of resins we can use. We already know we have the molds. Molds are pretty simple. These ones are silicone. Of course, we sell silicone, so we're biased. Silicone molds, we're biased. Some people make their own molds out of acrylic or HDPE. They will all work just as well. We obviously have the silicone because you don't have to seal it, you don't have to assemble it, and it's super easy to demold. But of course, like all silicone molds, you'll want to use a mold release before pouring your epoxy or your resin into the mold to make sure that it's easy to remove. Now, over here, you'll probably see on my left is 3 different types of resins. We have Illuminolite Clear Slow. This is a urethane-based resin. Now, it's not an epoxy resin, it's a urethane resin. Now, what's cool about this stuff, and you'll see a lot of wood turners and people like Scott's Mini Wood Shop using this product because it sets up really quickly, and I mean ridiculously quickly. So I'm going to show you one that I did with one of our pot molds, and we just done as a sample. It did not turn out very well, but it gives you a good example of kind of what to expect. This particular mold had some curling from the exothermic reaction because it sets up so quickly, and it's got some bubbles in it. And that's kind of what to expect. Specifically the curling, not necessarily the bubbles. I did not degas the product before I poured it, so that could be responsible for some of the bubbles, but you can see in the middle there, it's relatively clear just for the micro bubbles that are in there. So it is a very, very good product, but it requires post-processing. By that I mean you can't just pour the urethane into here and then take it out and call it a day. It's going to be kind of curled up just from the heat, maybe bubbled up a bit. You need to trim it, sand it, plane it, finish it. Or in the case of if you're wood turning it, it doesn't matter because you're going to be taking off a lot of material anyway, which is why that Illuminolite resin is great for wood turners and things like that, because you really do need to do some post-processing. Most resin artists don't have, from being in this industry for now 3 and a bit years, I know most resin artists don't have the tools and, I want to say know-how, but the tools and, the setup to do that kind of post-processing. They don't have planers, they don't have big sanders, they definitely don't have wood turning lathes. So then it brings us to the next option, which are the epoxy resin bases. And essentially in here you have 2 types. You've got a relatively quick set, and then you've got a very, very slow set, deep pour. And really the core difference with these is the exothermic time and the time to set the heat generated, so to speak. The quick set, or rather thick set, from Total Boat is an awesome product. We're a big fan of Total Boat. They're a big fan of us. This is a product that you can pour in 1 to 2 inch pour heights. 2 inch if you're using small molds. I wouldn't necessarily consider something like this a small mold. This is probably borderline. But essentially you can't pour this in a 4 or 5 inch height and just leave it. You'll end up with the same kind of thing with the alumina. You'll end up with a really strong exothermic reaction, a lot of heat, bubbles, curling, things like that. Probably a ruined piece. So if you're going to use something like this, you want to use it in stages or multi-pours, which is awesome. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. And that way you can carefully control the reaction and make sure each layer is set properly before you pour the next. So if we were going to use a thick set by Total Boat in this mold, we would do it in 2, probably 3 pours. We put our pieces in, we'd do a pour maybe an inch, inch and a half, and then the next day we'd come back and do another level, and the next day we'd do another level. So over the course of 3 or 4 days, we would end up with this thing full. And the cool thing about this stuff is it sets up typically in 24 hours. So you can demold it and work with it within 24 to 48 hours, depending on the size of the finished product. So that's one option. That's the second option. The third option is using a deep pour resin. So this is something that you would use for river tables. For example, if you had like a 2 or 3 inch thick river table that was 7 or 8 or 10 feet long, we've got a huge volume of epoxy. This stuff is great because it's super thin, almost water-like, and it'll easily release the bubbles, almost to the point where you don't have to use a torch. Like you literally just leave it, and the stuff's so thin that when the bubbles come to the top, they just pop and go away. Not to say that I wouldn't watch it over the course of a few hours or a day to make sure you don't have to pop any of those bubbles, but that's definitely a cool advantage to this. The disadvantage being it takes 4 to 5 days to actually set. So this is not a quick process. Once you pour your mold, or once you put your stuff in there and you pour your resin, it's going to be 5 days before you can take it out. So really there's advantages and disadvantages of this. You've got a quick set relatively, but over the course of multiple pours, and you've got a ridiculously super fast set. I'm talking about this was ready to demold in like 3 or 4 hours. Like it was hard and ready to come out. So that's one option. That's the other option. That's this option. Now in this video, we're going to be using this third option, the slow setting, deep pour resin, all in one shot. The only thing to consider with this versus the other pieces, the other resins, is that, if in this case I'm using wood. If you're using just resin, it wouldn't matter. But in the case of wood, I'm putting this wood, which is pre-cut for this mold. I've already pre-cut this, and it is a maple burl end cap, which is basically came from that. A really expensive piece of wood, but it has that cool kind of like alien look to it, which is what's perfect for these Star Wars models. So I've pre-cut this on almost 6x6, which is the diameter or dimensions of this mold. And what I'm getting at is that once we put this in and we pour the entire thing with resin, just like doing a resin pour with a charcuterie board thing, this is going to want to rise. So there's a couple of ways around it. You can either do an initial small pour, like, half an inch with either of these, and that will set it and create a base that once you pour more resin on, it's not going to get underneath and lift the wood. Or you can weigh it down with like a metal stick, or you can, with a silicone mold specifically, if your wood is equal to or very close to the diameter, or I keep saying diameter, the width of the mold, you can actually clamp it from the sides, which will compress the silicone a little bit just to grab onto the wood to prevent it from rolling up, which is a cool thing, a cool advantage of the silicone molds. So I think I've covered all that. Now with the wood, there's one other thing I wanted to say about this. These burl pieces tend to be full of holes and therefore full of air. So what I've seen some people do is they will use a wood stabilizer or at least coat it in resin all around first to make sure that it's not going to be releasing air bubbles the entire time. A wood stabilizer is a cool option. There's things like cactus juice, which you can buy online and from different wood stores, but it's like essentially you put this stuff in the stabilizer and it's so thin that it penetrates the wood and stabilizes the wood, creating a much more weight and a solidified object that is not going to expand and contract like typical wood. So that is one option, to use a wood stabilizer or coat it in resin. And again, in this case, I'm not doing that because I'm using the long deep pore stuff, deep pore resin, which is going to release bubbles anyway. And because of the nature of this model, where it's a essentially a spaceship on a different planet theoretically, I actually think that having these little, it's really hard to see, but there's little tiny holes in there. If we did get a column of bubbles trapped, I think it would just add to the model, and I think it would look really cool. So we'll see how it turns out at the end of this video. Again, if you wanted to purchase one of these molds to do something like this, whether it's a diorama or casting solid resin blocks or casting bouquets, wedding flowers, etc., you can go to craftedelements.com. We have a few different sizes available and stock kind of fluctuates, but if we don't have it in stock, you can add yourself to a waiting list. All right, so let's get started with this project. I'm going to get the resin mixed and we're going to start our pour. Okay, I've got our epoxy all mixed up. This was a 2-to-1 ratio for this deep pour stuff. And I've already prepped our mold. By prep, typically you'll want to wash and dry the interior cavity of your mold, and then obviously spray it with your mold release. Let it set for about 10 or 15 minutes to dry. The mold release is important for silicone molds. It kind of creates a barrier between the epoxy and the silicone. Silicone molds will not last forever, and extending the life of them due to their cost is obviously a function. If you're using the mold release, you should be able to get 20, 30 pours out of this mold. If you're not using a mold release and you're just letting it kind of attack the silicone, the epoxy rather, you might be lucky to get 7, 8, 9 pours out of it. So you definitely want to use a mold release to protect your investment in any silicone mold, not just ours. So what I've done is I've already pre-cut a piece of our maple burl end cap, and then I have our little Star Wars die cast, I want to say micro machines. I think they're like a Star Wars Hot Wheels models, which a lot of people use for this. So let's talk about the models we're going to use for this project. A lot of people obviously will buy toys and things like that online, toy stores, model shops, to encase in resin, but there's a lot of different considerations when you're choosing the model. First of all, you need something very structurally sound. I've seen people try to cast submarines and other spaceships and things like that, where the toy or the model is hollow, and then the heat and pressure generated from the epoxy and the chemical reaction of the epoxy end up basically imploding the model and just crushing it and deforming it inside the sculpture, the diorama, and basically rendering it useless. So these particular models I'm going to use today are actually the Hot Wheels Star Wars collection, and they're actually like a die cast model, and they're fairly large. So this is one of the other models that came in that collection, whereas we're going to be casting the TIE Fighter today. But this is a fairly large model, and it's metal and hard plastic. If you do get a hollow model, the one trick is to drill a small hole in it and then inject epoxy resin, let it set, and become basically a solid model before you try and attempt to put it inside one of these castings. These are actually pretty cool. I think this is what Scott's Mini Wood Shop and Dario or Bryn Woodworking use on their castings. These are the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars RPG models. So basically, if you've ever played like an RPG game, like basically a board game. That's what these models are for. So you can get them on Amazon. You can get them from game supply stores and hobby supply stores. They are quite a bit smaller than these Hot Wheels models. I'll show you the scale to just clarify that. Right, it's a pretty big difference, but they're still very, very cool to cast in resin, and they work really, really well for that. Of course, these are spaceships, but there are things like the, you know, like 1/64 scale model cars. There's a Kawasaki Mule, I believe, an ATV. So these things all work really well in resin. Now, as far as attaching them, there's some different considerations. I want to bring up one. If you're doing a floating model, like a floating spaceship, for example, like if you want that floating in the resin, you can't just drop it in and hope it stays there. You need to attach it somehow. So there's a few ways to do that. Obviously, in this pour, that's a fairly heavy model. It's a fairly large model, these Hot Wheels models. So we're just going to glue it to the maple burl with hot glue. The key consideration is that you need to make something relatively rigid. So something that's not going to melt with the temperature and pressure caused by the epoxy. And then something that's just going to be strong enough. So I found hot glue does work. It's a little bit more noticeable than some of the other options, but super glue also works, or CA glue. So you can use CA glue or super glue to attach your models directly to, say, a piece of wood or whatever you're casting. But let's say you actually want to have the model free floating above the wood like you would a spaceship. One of the suggestions made to me by Scott Wishart over at Scott's mini workshop, or mini wood shop rather, is to use effectively this super thin plastic strand wire, which is basically used for like fiber optic lighting, LED lighting, when they do like headliners and stuff of cars. You can actually connect these to an LED powered box, and then they project a little light at the end of them. But this stuff is actually thick enough. This particular stuff is 1 millimeter, but you can also get thinner stuff. I probably wouldn't use anything less than 1 millimeter because you want to be able to support the model. But it actually holds up really well in a pipe form. You know, you don't need a lot of it. So the trick is here. In the case of this, I know Scott did a video with Illuminlight, which I can reference here. But what they ended up doing is drilling a tiny little hole in this model, attaching the clear plastic wire or clear plastic tube here with CA glue or super glue, and then doing the same thing, drilling a tiny little hole in the wood, and then effectively having that model suspend over the wood. So that's definitely one consideration. You can buy little tiny plastic rods that are thicker than this, but that will work just as well. So there's a lot of different things you can do to suspend the model in the resin. But like I said, what we're going to do with our pour here is use hot glue and glue it right to the piece of wood before we cast it. Another consideration, depending on what kind of sculpture diorama you're making that you're going to cast in resin, is model train parts. So if you go to a model train shop, and there's a lot of online model train retailers as well, they sell, like, there's different scales of model trains, like N scale, TT, HO, depending on, you know, how big you want your item. But they have a lot of different things: houses, cars. One of these cool things here is trees and shrubs. So what I actually ordered these from Amazon, but there's, you know, these are large trees, but I can easily take a piece of this off, glue it to the wood, and create more of a landscape with these trees as well, just to make it even cooler and a little bit more realistic, which I will do in a future video with a different model. So yeah, that's one thing, is model train parts and model train accessories can work in these pours as well. So I've already got my glue gun here, and I've got our TIE fighter ready to go, and I'm just going to position it like this and fill a little bit of glue in there. Try to make it as clean as possible so we can't see it with the resin. Hold on to it and let it dry. All right, we've got our model glued to our wood block. And now we're ready to put it into the mold and get this poured. Slipped it right in. I put a piece of plastic under this just so I can move it from my workbench because it's going to take 4 or 5 days to set up and I don't want it sitting here in my way. And then I'm going to use my clamp. Again, in this case, because the wood is so close to the size of the silicone mold, we can clamp it and that will prevent the wood from rising with the epoxy. As I said earlier in the video, if you do a small initial pour, you know, of 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, fill the bottom, and then do another pour on top of that, that would also prevent the wood from rising up. So there's a couple different ways to do it. And in this case, I've used just completely clear. I haven't used any pigment or colorant. I want to see how clear we can get this thing. Obviously, you know, there's a bajillion things you could do with this to make it look cooler. You could get a small amount of lava and kind of pour it down here to kind of trickle down the burl. There's a lot of different things. You could pre-color the burl if you wanted to, but again, keeping the burl the same, keeping this simple, just to kind of show you, you know, how it's done. I'm going to slowly pour our epoxy in here. And like I said, because this is the deep pour stuff, it's very, very thin. You're going to end up with you know, any bubbles that show up are going to quickly dissipate. You can see the bubbles coming up from the wood and the little fissures in the wood. We'll come back in 4 or 5 days once it's set, demold it, and see how it turned out. And since I have some resin left, I decided I might as well just go and do another one and use our cylinder mold and then a pre-cut piece of Wormy maple. And what's really cool is that I used a 3-inch hole saw to cut this out. Nothing fancy, just a regular 3-inch hole saw. Because this is a 3-inch diameter and the 3-inch hole saw has an exterior diameter of 3 inches, this piece is slightly under 3 inches, which makes it really easy to drop in. So that's a quick tip if you're using these cylindrical molds. I've just gone ahead and taken a piece of resin, kind of geometric resin fox head, and stuck it there. And we'll drop it in our mold. And we'll take the rest of our resin and pour it in. All right, we're back. It's about 5 days later, maybe 6, and we're gonna demold these from our silicone molds. Now, when you're using deep molds like this, you can fight with them and have a chance of ripping them. What I recommend is just actually pouring some water along the sides. It's best to use distilled water, ideally, because it won't leave any sort of you know, watermarks and iron marks or whatever minerals are in your water within the side of the mold. But I'm going to just cheat and use just some spring water. And doing this basically just creates a little bit of lubrication to help the model pop out of there, or help your cast pop out of there rather. And it's just much, much easier to get out, especially when it comes to these really skinny, deep ones like this cylinder mold here, right? So once you get the water in there, you can just kind of work it out. You can see it's coming out there, or wants to come out. You know, you don't want to bend these and invert these molds because you'll end up ripping them. So, and they're certainly not cheap, and it's not something you want to do. So there's one, came out really easy after you add the water. And I'll get this guy out. Just the big project of this video is this Star Wars model, and you can see it just pops right out of there. Looking beautiful. Oh wow, look at that. This just requires a little bit of basic trimming with the meniscus around the top, the sharp edge that comes out when the epoxy rides up the edge of the mold. There's a little bit of bubbling in it. Probably would have benefited from some you know, more gentle stirring of the epoxy, but I think it looks great. Now the one thing is, I would say, other than taking the meniscus off here, this is, you know, a ready display piece, except a really annoying fly decided to land in my resin while it was setting. So there's like a little blemish right, it's kind of hard to see, it's wet now, but there's a little blemish right there. So thank you, Mr. Fly. I'm now going to have to sand and buff that part out, but otherwise that's our completed block. We could go ahead and run this through the router, chamfer the edge. If you want to have the wood exposed instead of encased in the epoxy resin or the urethane resin, depending on what resin you're using, you could certainly just run this through a table saw or band saw. take it off, you know, an eighth or a quarter of an inch to get the wood exposed as well as the epoxy, and then, you know, keep sanding, buffing, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to have kind of a ready to go model, this is the best way to do it. And just, you know, trim the edges, clean up the edges, and just do a final seal or a coat of epoxy over top if you've roughed up the edges a little bit, and that would be it. So let's go and do a quick finish, and then we'll get a final look at this model. So just to take the meniscus off this, I'm going to use a 120 grit sandpaper, and just go kind of on an angle, not to scratch up the top surface. Now that I've sanded that, you're obviously going to need to keep resanding these edges to get them polished up again. So we'll go to a 220 and probably like somewhere between 300 and 500, and then a final with like a 1200 grit, and then we'll see what it looks like. So I've sanded the block, the sides and the edges down to about 1200 grit. I want to stress that I did not have to sand this. You could technically just take it out of that mold, get rid of the top lip, the meniscus, and you'd have a beautiful clear product. The only reason I decided to sand it is to get rid of the fly blemish that was in the top, and then also to round off all the edges so they weren't so sharp. Because you round off everything with a sander or router effectively, then you have to sand and buff it to get that super clear look to it. So how would you do that? If I wanted to do it the harder way, and I want to say the proper way, but the keep going in different stages way, I would go from, you know, a 1200 grit to a 1500 grit to a 2000 grit, and then I'd maybe move over to like a plastic polish or a plastic buffing compound in a more, you know, rough, thicker granule to a very, very fine buffing compound. So you could do something like this. This is an automotive product. This is called Plastics. A lot of people use something called Novus. I use it personally for my pinball machine play fields for polishing them up. There are like a Novus 1, 2, and 3. There's different coarse grains of Novus, and that will actually allow you to use like a buffing wheel, like a soft buffing wheel on your sander, and then just buff it and buff it and buff it. But that's a very progressive, longer play. I mean, it requires quite a bit of work to get from, you know, which is more or less translucent, back to that super clear look. So what I'm going to do is take the cheater way, which is still going to look awesome. It's easier. It just depends on, you know, the final outcome, what you want and how much work you want to put into it. But I'm going to tape up the bottom, and then I'm going to just do a coat of epoxy, of clear epoxy over this. So I've mixed up some Total Boat epoxy, and all I need to do is coat the top, sides, and surface, let it dry, and it will be super clear again. All right, so I've just raised it up on a little plastic block there, so I can get underneath and the sides and not having to get a bunch of epoxy built up. I'm just gonna finish stirring up this, which is a Total Boat casting epoxy. Sets in 24 to 48 hours. Because I'm not using too much of it, just a gentle stir should avoid any bubbles. If I was doing a lot of it, probably wouldn't be so aggressive in the stirring. As soon as I start pouring this, you'll see it pop, and you'll see the nice clarity come out. You want to make sure you get coverage on all sides and edges, because if you just let it drip down, the surface tension sometimes misses parts of the epoxy, and then you end up having to do the whole thing over again because you didn't get uniform coverage. Doing it this way also is kind of a cheater way to fill any sort of bubbles or imperfections that got in between the mold and your piece as well. So you'll get a nice kind of fill of epoxy around any sort of micro bubbles and deviations on the outside surface. The other cool thing about this is that it is self-leveling, most epoxies, but when you're doing it like this on a flat cube, you get a little bit of a dome just because of, again, the meniscus kind of effect here. So it's going to dome up a little bit. All right. Got full coverage, and it's going to look great once it's fully set, and it will be a completed project. Well, the resin is dried on our Star Wars TIE Fighter model project. There's some different things we could have done with this project, a few different ways we could have finished it. In hindsight, you know, I always like to critique my work, but in hindsight, I probably would have fully sealed the wood first with resin because we did end up with quite a few micro bubbles inside the model. It still looks good, but just an observation. And of course, finishing it. You know, I did the top coat with epoxy, but we could have used you know, fully buffed it, sanded it, buffed it, and used a plastic polish. We also could have used something like Rubio monocoat to give it a nice hard wax surface. That probably would have avoided a little bit of work as well. If you're looking to create things like that, encase models, toys, and flowers, and other things that you can encase in resin, we do have a full line of molds for you at craftedelements.com. If there's an item that you see that's out of stock, you can always add your name to the notification list, a waiting list, and we'll notify you as soon as it becomes available again. If you have any other questions or comments or concerns, you can always reach out to us via our website at craftedelements.com. Just head over to the contact section. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to us here on YouTube because we're always making some cool things with resin, plastic, and wood here in the shop. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it educational. Have an awesome day, and may the force be with you.